Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where we cultivate change from the inside out as we ponder the Cairo question. Will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? We stand on the belief that dismantling racism goes beyond laws and legislation or politics and economics. Here, anti-racism activation is presented as an inside job where personal transformation and accountability impact social change. So take a seat at the anti-racism activation table with Inflection Point Podcast.
Well, thank you all for joining us for yet another episode of Inflection Point Podcast. At Inflection Point Podcast, we are dedicated to the art of listening and authentic conversation. We challenge our audience to listen actively and intentionally for the purpose of awareness, understanding, and ultimately transformation. My name is Anita Russell, and I am your host. And here's a quick hello from Mavis and Gail.
Hi, I'm Mavis Bauman. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Gail Hunter, and welcome to the night.
Excellent. So let's just jump right in. Our conversation today is centered around a topic that we had looked at a couple of episodes ago, and that topic is America's triple threat: fear, racism, and guns. So for this evening's discussion, we are going to ponder this question. Are thoughts and prayers just idle lamentations without a clear path to action? So at this point, I'm going to pass the baton over to Mavis, and she's going to open up our first segment, and she's going to explore the value of thoughts and prayers.
I'm sure going to give it a try, Anita. I will start out with a quote here from crosswalk.com. It's a Christian publication. The quote is, "While offering condolences has been commonplace throughout time, using the phrase thoughts and prayers appears to have become more prevalent as social media has taken over communication in the past few years." The organization PNAS, which is Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, has actually done a study on this to test the reactions of people to thoughts and prayers. And they say offering thoughts and prayers has become a standard response from both US policymakers and the public to major catastrophes, including hurricanes, wildfires, mass shootings, and disease outbreaks. Despite the frequent usage of these gestures on behalf of people experiencing hardship, the value of thoughts and prayers to recipients remains unknown. So I'm just going to stop a minute and warn you that my section really is just a question. What are we doing? What are we doing about all of the mass shootings, about the resulting fear, about the loss of life? What are we doing? I happen to be a woman of God, a believer. So prayer, if someone says, I'm going to pray for you, I receive that as something very valuable. And if it comes from someone who I know is also a believer, I know that there's power in that offering. If Anita says, Maeve, I'm going to be praying for you, I believe her. Same with Gail. I know that their hearts are in it, and that is action. But when thoughts and prayers comes from a political leader, a president even, or a lawmaker, what does it really mean? Sometimes, I feel as an individual that it's a way to end the conversation. It's, I can't handle this grief, and I don't know what to do. And that's kind of what I found in my study for this. So this organization, PNAS, actually established a value, this is a scientific study, of between $0 and $5, and did a sample amongst a number of recipients, asking to establish a monetary value to their reaction to thoughts and prayers. And the value went all the way up to nearly $5 to a negative $5. So again, I think people respond based on where they are in their belief systems, and all the way out to where an atheist might be completely offended and receive it negatively. So, this underscores the idea that words matter. Words matter so heavily, and especially when there's loss of life and people are grieving. So I'm just going to reiterate my question to keep my mind focused, which is, what are we doing about the problem of our kids getting shot in schools, our parishioners getting shot in their houses of worship, people dying in grocery stores from rampant shooters? I saw a piece in Time magazine that goes back to 2017, actually, where they were arguing or challenging this phrase again after one of the mass shootings in Texas, that others had responded by criticizing thoughts and prayers as a pathetic substitute for taking concrete action. And I don't know if y'all ever watched Samantha Bee. She had a show called Full Frontal, and she would really take a head-on approach to political issues and kind of make fun of them in a way. She organized a gospel choir to sing a parody on thoughts and prayers. And so then there was a response, a critical response to her critique on thoughts and prayers. Often liberals were then taken to task for their unholy dismissal of thoughts and prayers, which led to further criticisms. So it just went back and forth, and no action resulted from the words, thoughts and prayers. And the article says it was just a deflection guarding another deflection. So getting back to what is a leader? What do we want leaders to say? What do we want lawmakers to say after a horrific event? What do we want them to do? What do we want them to do? I really felt for President Obama when I read in a Business Insider article. He says, "I feel like I've used up all my words. Nothing I've been able to say, whether making practical, rational arguments or emotional arguments. I've shown anger in speaking about this. I've shown sorrow, and nothing seems to have any impact. I'm out of words." That article goes on to say that nearly 400 times in 2020 alone, elected officials and staffers who have become our public grief counselors have had to draft remarks memorializing the loss of some 15,000 lives. That's according to the data from Gun Violence Archive, which defines a mass shooting as 4 or more people shot and or killed in a single incident at the same time, and it doesn't include the shooter if the shooter dies. So there was an act that was, says the definition was included in the, quote, Investigative Assistance for Violent Crimes Act of 2012, which became a law after Sandy Hook. So they had to define what a mass shooter was. So we did get some legislation there. But their jobs have become tougher as political will in Congress for even substantive gun reforms remains ever tenuous. One writer says, it feels hollow. Thoughts and prayers feels hollow and is just a fig leaf for action. Mm. So that, they moved forward and said, this has got to be off limits for political speechwriters. And I have to agree with that. The mayor of Boulder, Colorado says it has all the personalization of a Hallmark card. Nice, but you can just hand it out. You didn't write it, you didn't feel it, you didn't act. If that's literally the best thing you can do and nothing more, that's when it becomes offensive. So I am coming up to my time here, but I just want to close out with the question again: what are we doing to stop this violence? What is Congress doing? I saw a quote from President Biden in March of 2023 on CNN, and he said, "I can't do anything except plead with Congress to act responsibly," which does not sound hopeful. So maybe we can chat about this. What do you ladies think so far about what I've pulled up?
Yeah, so it's very daunting when you, so it's one thing when you kind of see the shootings one at a time, right? So it'll be like the Buffalo, it'll be the Jewish synagogue in Pittsburgh, it'll be whatever, whatever, whatever. But when you aggregate all of that and you see the sheer numbers, it's mind blowing because every single one of those people involved represents a family, somebody's sister, mother, brother, auntie, grandmother. All of these represent individual lives.
And the communities affected by each life.
Connections and relationships, right?
Yeah, each life.
It's not just those numbers.
I did want to get in something here that is even more provocative. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries says that universal criminal background check legislation has the support of more than 90% of Americans. The majority of Republicans and NRA support it. But Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy says gun violence won't be solved by legislation. This country needs to have a conversation. We have to see what's driving mental illness. And that's another cop-out, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Such a cop-out because in some of the research that I did, for example, there was an article that I read in Psychology Today, and it was saying that mass shooters don't necessarily fit the definition of mental health as defined by the mental health community. Mm-hmm. And so because if you think about like when we grew up, right, all the sci-fi films, and it was always this psychotic killer and, you know, all of this stuff. And so it stigmatized mental health in such a dramatic way. And it's so ingrained in our socialization. You hear people say, oh, the crazies or this terminology and all of that, and none of that. Because when you really look at the numbers of crimes and things like that that are committed by mental health, people who are experiencing a mental health issue, it's low. Like schizophrenic people are not mass psychotic people who go out and murder people. But that's what we've been socialized to believe.
Right. You know, with respect to mental illness, I imagine Gail will get into this, but you think we've got mental illness now? One of the common characteristics of shooters, according to that scientific study, was trauma in early childhood. So look at these kids that are going to grow up who have experienced a school shooting. You think that's not going to cause some mental illness, or certainly horrible, horrible phobias? So don't hide behind that because you're building it essentially.
No, and PTSD is not considered a mental illness. Post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not.
Right.
Interesting. Yeah, the young man that was a shooter at Sandy Hook. One of the things that he said afterwards was that he walked into the school and he saw on the face of the children his own face as a child, right? And all the trauma.
Yeah, I think that is a really dangerous mix-up, another deflection into the world of things that people are calling mentally ill, but it's not in the DSM, right? No. Not qualified as a mental illness. They're upset, they're angry, they don't understand the impact of taking a life.
But something in their life, they could have been going along in their life and all of a sudden something triggered them.
Yeah.
And it's that trigger that triggered the past, whatever the abuse or trauma has been in their life, that it's just like a snap. And it's more a reactivity to what has happened to them, childhood or what has happened to them throughout their life, than a mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar, or the personality disorders. Those are what's considered mental illness. And that's not who you're seeing are the mass shooters.
Right, right.
They know what they're planning to do. Yeah.
We're going to segue now into the next piece so we can stay track and everything. So in this piece, I'm going to take a look at it's a research article that I had read, and it was an article that was produced by it's the let me make sure I got the name right, the Journal of Trauma Nursing.com. And so this is a research that was conducted by some individuals that included trauma nurses. So the title of the research paper is A Narrative Inquiry into the Experience of Being a Victim of Gun Violence, right? So I'm going to rearrange my thing a little bit so I can speak to this. Okay. So just based on the conversation that we've had so far, everybody knows that gun violence is a problem. Everybody ought to know by now that gun violence is a public health crisis in the United States. And so this study was done to provide some insight into the personal experience. That's what I was talking about earlier, that these are like personal things that are happening to these individuals, right? That are impacting them for the rest of their lives, right?
Their lives.
And so, yeah, so victims of gun violence experience challenges that are related to poverty, deficient educational preparation, and community neglect. So this is sort of a part of the abstract that describes kind of what was the outcome of the research. So I'm going to walk you through some of the highlights of the of this research that was done. And the first thing that they say is that gun violence is overrepresented by the poor. So statistically, there is a correlation between poverty and violence. So persons who are born into poor households, they have a higher rate of violence that involves a firearm. But what the research is saying, not just this research, but research in general, is that gun violence is a part of that vicious cycle. Let me make one adjustment here. It's a part of a vicious cycle between racism, poverty, and social inequity and social inequality in this country. And so when you look at, again, that 50,000 foot view, you can see how these things are interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
And so it goes on to say that the exposure to violence, this is what Gail was alluding to, the exposure to violence at a young age impacts the educational achievement of children in these violent communities, right? Their brains are impacted, and Gail can talk a lot more about that aspect than I certainly can, but I just wanted to kind of say that their brain development is impacted, and when their brain development is impacted, it also impacts their ability to learn, right? And so a major contributing factor, this is obvious, is that the prevalence of gun violence is associated with the accessibility to guns. Guns are big business in the United States. Let's just keep it real. Let's just keep it honest. And the United States is a major weapons supplier in the world, right? So not just here, but globally, we are a major weapons supplier, right? And then this statement just really kind of blew me away. Approximately 20% of gun owners own 65% of the guns. So it's a very small portion of people that have this huge arsenal, right? And when you couple that with the accessibility, you can see the problems that we are having. So then sort of an offshoot from the gun violence also is all of the injury that's associated with it, right? People spending time in hospitals, that is expensive. So we're now also impacting our healthcare system to a really great degree. And the number that I have here, this is going back to like 2017, $100 billion annually related to gun violence, right? Taxpayers pay roughly $12.8 million every day to cover the cost of gun-related deaths and injuries. Just let that sink in. Imagine what we could do with that kind of money if it wasn't being
Yes, that's right.
Fighting gun violence, right? And so the paper goes on to say, I'm going to kind of introduce you a little bit into this particular study. And they did this study to provide insight into gun violence through the victim's perspective, right? The personal account of being a victim of gun violence and using that to provide more knowledge to understand things from the victim's perspective. Because when you think about it in a way, the victim's perspective, and obviously these are people who survived gun violence, right? And so what is that lasting impact on those individuals? And that was part of what they wanted to ask. So their specific research question was, what is the story of being a victim of gun violence from the perspective of the victim? So you hear people talking all the time about this narratives, you know, people sharing their narratives. And this particular study, research study, the methodology that they use is called narrative inquiry. And narrative inquiry is the study of stories and narratives, because stories and narratives are that fundamental unit that reflects the human experience. We tell our stories. We tell our childhood stories. We tell what happened to us along the way in our lives, right? And so the study consisted of 16 one-on-one, face-to-face interviews that allowed the participants to describe in their own words their experience of being a gun violence victim. Each one of the interviews lasted about an hour, and they had lots of parameters around the interview. How are we going to set it up and all of that? So I'm not going to go into all of that detail, but one thing I will say is that the relaying of a personal story that contains a traumatic event such as being shot has the potential to elicit all these feelings of anxiety, apprehension, and fear. And so when they put this study together, they had to be cognizant of that. And so they had to make sure that they were creating a safe space for people to share some of their experiences. And so the study participants, there were 16 of them, and they did this research in a level one trauma center in like a metropolitan city in the United States. There were 16 people in the study. The average age was 35 or so, but the range of ages was 18 to 71. Most of the people, there were 13 of the participants were Black, 3 were Caucasian, 13 were male, 2 participants were female, and 1 participant was transgender. So they tried to get like a diverse composition, even though the study number of 16 is relatively small, but they wanted to make sure that they at least had that diversity in the composition. And so there were 4 major categories that came out of the work. And so they did all of the study. Oh, here it is. They did all of the studies, and then they took all of the studies that were by audio tape. They took all of those, they transcribed them. They had multiple research investigators that are involved in transcribing the information and checking and rechecking and all of that. So it seems to me that they did a pretty thorough job. And after analyzing all of the data, what they found were these 4 themes that emerged. The first one, the prevailing nature of everyday violence and how that was a factor in the lives of these individuals, feeling abandoned by the institutions of society. So, for example, the police department, people feeling abandoned by the police or lack of police in these particular communities, the lack of things for the kids to do, no community centers, and all of those different types of things that are kind of associated with those community institutions that need to be a part of a child's life growing up. Living in a context of reactive violence, fueled by poverty and the lack of employable skills and education. And then finally, those evolving psychological effects following gun violence. So I'm going to just provide you what the overall conclusion was, and then we'll take we'll take a break. And so the overall conclusion of the study was that gun victims are overrepresented by those living in poverty. Community leaders and community members need to work together to improve the living conditions of people in poverty and improve education for further prevention. Victims of gun violence are struggling with many challenges. Their personal stories of violence provided a greater understanding into their experiences. And so the whole entire point was to hear the voice of those individuals who are personally impacted as gun violence survivors. So we're going to go ahead and take a break at this point, and then we'll come back and maybe have a short discussion on what I presented, and then we'll move into Gail's portion of the program. So welcome back to our show. You are listening to Inflection Point Podcast, and our topic of the hour is, are thoughts and prayers just idle lamentations without a clear path to action? So at this point, I'm going to pass the baton over to Gail, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about causes and impact, particularly from a trauma perspective.
Okay. Well, uncovering the causes of gun violence has been a challenge for many, mostly in part because the research is limited by the federal legislation that constrains research funding on the issue. In 1996, the so-called Dickey Amendment was passed by Congress. The law has been interpreted as prohibiting the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from conducting firearms research. However, that did not stop the scholars from different universities from doing their own research, which is what I'm going to talk about. That mostly from Stanford University, from the different scholars in different departments there who have been over the last few years been doing research on this. Their research, one study by Stephanie Chow found that the states with stricter gun laws have lower rates of gun deaths among children and teenagers, and states with child prevention access laws are linked with fewer gun suicides in this age group also. So if you put more regulations on firearms, does it make a difference? Dr. Chow said that it does end up saving children's lives. Her analysis found that states with the strict, as I said, have a 2.6% per 1,000 children over mortality rate with states that have least strict laws, where their mortality rate is almost double at 5% per 100,000. So uncovering the causes of gun violence has always been a challenge, as I said, and in part the limited research that's been prohibited has been part of that. There's a scholar, Nidam Shah, at the Stanford School of Medicine, has written about how this has affected empirical study, but it hasn't deterred the scholars there. Dr. David Studdert, also at the School of Medicine, studied the devastating consequences of gun violence, particularly the risk it poses to public health. And Amaya Rawson Slater, an associate professor of medicine and a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research has also looked into long-term impact of gun violence, specifically among American children who experience a shooting at their school. And by looking at the costs involved in helping our children and adolescents heal after they experience a gun shooting. And Anita mentioned that earlier about the medical costs that's involved in this, which is astronomical, aside from whatever the mental health and other issues are that these children have to go through. She found that the children and adolescents have a higher rate of absenteeism after they've been experienced or exposed to a gun shooting. They have lower high school and college graduation rates. And their mid-20s, they tend to earn less income than their peers do. So primarily, what happens to these children or adults after a shooting? Well, they no longer feel safe and their nervous system has been affected and they feel disconnected from their social engagement system of their nervous system, which is something we all have. The nervous system has gone off balance and activated either that fight or flight of the sympathetic nervous system, which is mobilization and can be experienced as anxiety and anger and reactivity, hypervigilance, anger towards self, towards survivor's guilt, even for survivor's guilt, or projection and then displacement of the anger onto other people. Or they're activated in that dorsal, what they call the dorsal vagal part of the nervous system, which is often termed as the freeze part. Our primitive brain, when we go into fight or flight, that we go into this fight, flight, or freeze, and it's an autonomic reaction to whatever stressors are going on in our life. And so when somebody goes into the dorsal vagal, they go into a depression, they go into like a shutdown mode. You can see this in animals, that some animals actually, when they have the same autonomic nervous system, that like a rabbit will freeze if they think a predator is near, or an antelope will freeze to the point where they look like they're dead to their prey. But if they don't move, I know for a rabbit, if a rabbit doesn't move, they may not survive that. Their heart may not come back up. So it's a survival mechanism, but it also has a negative impact on the person, or certainly on the animals, but also on people too, and children. Because when we are constantly connected to the sympathetic or to the dorsal vagal, we are not able to connect to our prefrontal cortex, which is where all our executive functioning is, and which is where we can access that vagus part of our nervous system, where we can feel calmer and more engaged socially, and we feel safe. So these young people are coping not just with what they experience, but they're coping with the grief as they face all sorts of different kinds of losses, including that of a loved one or a routine of their own, feeling of sense of safety. And when we don't feel safe, we're not functioning very well, right? Even as an adult, let alone as a child. The resisting the impulse to try and fix the situation really doesn't go a long way towards healing. Says Rabbi Patricia Carlin Newman. She's a senior associate dean for the religious life at Stanford University. We're so good at fixing things, at being able to just shove our emotions away and do our work with our heads down. But this is one of those things that just can't be fixed. She does a program called Schools In, and with Dan Schwartz and Denise Pope from Stanford also, where they help young people experience their grief and help adults learn how to support their children through whatever form it takes in order to be there and be present with their kids. Because children really feel these emotions very powerfully. And to preclude them from feeling pain is not ever going to be helpful. When it comes to preparing young people for the discomfort of grief, she says, it is much better to be far more honest than you would ever think you would need to be. Because kids get it, they feel it. And when we're not able to connect to them, say, I can hear that you're feeling this or that, then we lose them, right? Because they're feeling it, but they're getting a message from us that says, you don't want to know what I really feel. You don't want to really be present with what I'm really feeling, because it's making the adult uncomfortable. And so her recommendation is that we really might have to be present with our children who are experiencing whatever the trauma has been in regards to a shooting, or even when no one was killed, but there was just a shooter in the school, as some kids have experienced and some adults. It's still really important to really be able to talk about their narrative, their story, as Anita had mentioned before, had mentioned before, how crucial that can be. So that Maya Ross and Slater from Stanford found that students exposed to school shootings face lasting, persistent adversity in their educational and long-term economic outcomes, as I've mentioned before. So what do we do about this? What can we do about this? Right? I mean, they're finding that it's very obvious that these kids are suffering and suffering, even if they were not directly shot. They were wounded, if they witnessed the woundedness, they witnessed the death, but all of these kids are being affected. This team that I mentioned before, the Marika Cabral, Bok Hyun Kim and Molly Schnell, with Ross and Slater, they collected and analyzed this data on individual students' educational and their economic trajectories through the age of 26. Their findings were that students really were likely to be absent from school. They also looked at how they were doing and if they graduated from high school and what were they doing, and they found that there was a decrease in their functioning ability and their ability to earn enough income to finish college or even go to college. So, yeah, this has been going on for so many years that I wonder, and we talked a little bit before in the break, that we can't allow this to become normalized, and so that we become numb ourselves to what this experience is like, because we really do have to do something collectively as a country, as a human race. That there are other countries that have done something about this and have successfully been able to limit and eliminate the gun violence and the massive shootings. And I really believe that we have the ability within us to do that. There was a quote from the NRA that I was trying to find. I'm not sure if I can find it, but that basically it's been a repetitive response that basically says that that it is a polite community when everybody has a gun, that everybody then is going to be able to, right, to be respectful, that everybody has the option of shooting you. Now, I obviously that mentality is a little frightening, and that it's a statement that has come repeatedly from the NRA is even more frightening. And so I'm not here to bash the NRA, but I think we have to wake up and wake within ourselves and in all of these institutions that are affecting the choices that are being made in regards to gun protection laws and the safety of our children and of each of us. Something has to be done.
That's has to be done. I was going to read a quote from this Senator Tim Burchett, I think from Tennessee, after that recent shooting in Nashville, said, laws aren't going to make a difference.
No.
And then someone asked him, what about your child? Well, we homeschool her.
Well, and the one word that is being said,
that should not even be something that we have to do.
Right.
Like, I have to homeschool my children.
Right. Of course. Of course. But he can afford to do that.
Right. Well, that's like a whole other
That's
issue.
a whole other thing, right?
I mean, the number one
wait, that statement that you just read, because it's that mindset that says if everybody has a gun,
right,
we'll be safer. So
right, and it'll be a very polite society.
I read two articles earlier today. One was an article of a 1-year-old child who shot their sister or brother, shot their sibling because the parents had the gun out and accessible for this kid to get the gun. Thank God that the child wasn't killed. But can you imagine your little one having direct access to a gun, a real gun, not a toy gun, a real
loaded gun
that was loaded and ready to shoot? And that's what happened. They shot their child. Then there was another story about a little girl, maybe 6, I believe, who shot, I believe it was her sister, and killed her. Why? Because we don't have the wherewithal to take the responsibility that if you are going to have a gun in your home, that your children do not have access to that gun. That is absurd to me. So how in the world is that going to be safer? Because everybody has a gun in their house. What about all of the domestic violence things that go on in homes? And when there's a gun in the house, that gun is used.
Well, that's right. The statistics prove that out. Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
How, in the name of God,
Yeah.
can that be the answer?
No, it's not.
It's insane.
Well, and the number one reason why Americans say they want guns is for protection, because they believe they are not safe. And yet what they're doing is that they're creating a mindset, right? That says nobody is safe. That and the belief that that you can get into some other aspects of that belief, but that nobody is safe, and therefore we all should have, I mean, that's why we're not safe, right? Because people that don't realize what their use of a gun could be there for is not just for protection, right? And why do you need protection? Do you really need that kind of protection? Is that going to really solve that problem? No.
No
It's
way.
going to perpetuate it.
You have the gun in your home for protection.
Right.
You're not even taking the responsibility
To take care of it, right?
way so that your babies don't get a hold to it. Like, how is that even possible? How is that even possible?
It happens a lot, yes. Well, and the domestic violence, as you mentioned, is rampant with that. There's a more likelihood of somebody taking a gun and shooting their spouse or even their own children if there's a gun there.
And then, not to mention the suicide.
That's right.
Yeah.
More likely to be
right.
with
Especially for men, right? Or boys, yeah.
Yeah.
the monster that we're trying to protect ourselves from.
Oh,
Us.
it's actually within ourselves. It's
Yeah.
our belief
The
systems.
monster.
It's
Yeah.
our distorted belief systems that's the monster.
Absolutely.
And that's what has to change. They
Yeah.
can pass all the laws, but until we change those and reframe those beliefs, yeah.
Yeah. You know, I've heard people often compare licensing a gun to, well, why don't we do it like we license cars? And they think it's so much more of an infringement on their freedom to have to license a gun. Okay, let's get rid of all the roads and all the traffic signs and see how it goes. You know, it's a free-for-all, and it would be just carnage. And that's what we've got with this proliferation of guns. Yeah, that's a freedom I am willing to limit, you know, for myself, for everybody.
So everything that
Gotta
we
get
do
along.
kind of boils down to these two levels of gun violence. One is at the community level. And at that community level is where you see that intersection of race, poverty, social inequity, social inequality, inadequate health care, all of that that's based on, communities that don't get their needs met, right? They are deficient in education, the community itself is neglected. And then on top of that, you have the access to firearms. Then you look at on the mass shooting side of it, where you have individuals who may have themselves experienced childhood trauma. They're going through perhaps some personal crisis, or they have a specific grievance like hate or replacement theory. You know, they have this specific grievance, and then they have evidence, if you will, that validates how they're feeling, because they go on the internet and they get this information and they get that information.
Radicalized.
Where they're coming from, exactly. And now they're putting together this plan. And then the last piece that they have is access to firearms. So whether you're looking at it from the community level or you're looking at it through the mass shooting lens, the thing that's common in both of them, what it boils down to, is this access to firearms. And we don't have the sensibility or the wherewithal
Sense.
to limit.
Sense, yeah.
To at least start there. Oh.
That's where we need to start.
Yeah, because limiting it in any form would help, right? I mean, it's not an all or nothing, which seems to be the argument, you know, on the extreme side. We're just talking about getting a handle on this. And, you know, I know that there are so many guns that are not registered. You've got your 3D guns now, 3D printing of guns. I don't know what the answer to all that is, but what are we doing that we are not protecting our children? What are we doing?
And one of the statistics, it said that 20 years after the Columbine High School massacre, the number of school shootings in the United States has more than doubled. And Rosalyn Slater's paper and her co-authors, in 2018 and 19 alone, more than 100,000 American children attended a school where a shooting took place.
And the curve is going really steep up too,
Right.
steeply up.
Right. It's increasing. It has increased since then.
Yeah, and it's really featured in the news. In one piece I read, they were talking about, it really gets a lot of play if it's kids. It really gets a lot of play, you know, in the news, you know, based on certain circumstances. And I'm thinking, that's just despicable. Any life that's taken, you know, any life that's taken.
That's right.
It's like when our friend Pongasili died, which was tragic for us. A friend of mine said, well, did she live in a poor neighborhood? You know, as if somehow
that's the only place that occurs.
Her life, her death.
Right. As if somehow her life is less because she's in a poor neighborhood.
Yeah.
What is that?
Right, that's right.
That you actually think that way.
Yeah. Well,
exactly. There's nothing
racism. You know, racism, and
that's part of those belief systems that we have that have to be trained. They date back hundreds of years, right?
Right. And ignorance about what a poor neighborhood is really like. It's there are families, there are people connected to each other, there are people who protect each other.
Right.
You know, it's just it is this outside looking in judgment that is really destructive.
The judgment.
It's all judgment.
The judgment.
That's what's forming the beliefs. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can change that.
We can change that. That doesn't require legislation.
No, it doesn't.
we can change
it requires awareness and knowledge and consciousness and courage.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
What is it that you want people to do after listening to this podcast?
Just what I said.
Yeah.
Learn more, gain the knowledge, challenge your own belief systems. Look in the mirror and say, what do I believe? Look deeper, right? And listen to what really feels like it resonates as truth and what doesn't. And you know if it's absolutely true. Because if you just can't say this is absolutely true, a belief that you have, then listen to that. Go and explore and find out what is absolutely true.
Yeah. And ask yourself, where have you gone numb? How does thoughts and prayers feel to you now? What are the people that you're voting for? Be sure to vote. What are they voting for in Congress and in the Senate? What is happening? What are we doing?
Right.
Yeah, really, really look into it. I feel like, you know, have you ever heard this about doctors? It's sort of a joke, but, you know, what is a prescription? Well, it's a way to end the appointment. Thoughts and prayers is a way to end the conversation.
But this can't end yet.
It's a way to not feel, to not act. You know, I know it happened. You know, I've had the mic for a minute. We're done here. And for those affected directly, it goes on forever.
Well, and this is
Or
crossed
better than that.
This is crossed racial lines, it's crossed cultural, socioeconomic. I mean, this is all of our problems collectively.
Yes.
Each have to look in that mirror. Yeah.
And that brings me to the issue of civic engagement. This is a time in our history when we need civic engagement more than we have ever needed it before.
Amen.
Civic engagement is about voting. Civic engagement is about being involved in your community. Civic engagement is about you taking a stand that says, we do not want to live this way. We want our children to grow up in safety, right? So we're totally almost out of time. I know that doesn't make sense, totally almost. So I want to read this final quote, and this is from an artist by the name of Morgan Harper Nichols. And the quote says, "Don't let anyone tell you that these bad things happen and then everyone goes back to normal. You don't have to be everyone. Stay with the grief. Stay with the anger. Stay troubled by it all. Stay open-hearted to those who grieve. Stay tuned to those working for change." And so if you're listening to this podcast, I want you to ask yourself, what am I doing to work towards change?
Excellent.
So I want to thank you for joining us for this episode of Inflection Point Podcast here on Transformation Talk Radio. We are here every first and third Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time, and we will see you next time. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.